Welcome to Blackwood Hunting Society, folks. As tomorrow we are going to explore Oregon Caves National Monument and Preserve, I'd like to tell you boys a story about one of our old rangers. It isn't one I lived through myself. I first heard it when I was about your age. I was sitting around this very fireplace trying to prove I belonged among men who'd spent their lives in the wilderness. The man telling it was old Mr. Nathaniel Briggs. If you ever met Briggs, you listened. He wasn't loud. He didn't waste words. And he sure as hell didn't tell stories just to impress young hunters. I still remember that night. The wind sounded almost exactly like it does now. Briggs leaned forward, rested his hands on his knees, and looked at every one of us before speaking. "Boys," he said quietly, "I've spent more than 40 years working in forests, mountains, and places where people disappear for reasons that make perfect sense. One careless step, a loose rock, a broken leg. That's usually all it takes." He paused long enough for the cabin to become completely silent. "But every now and then, a man comes back carrying one question he spends the rest of his life trying to answer." Briggs reached for his coffee cup. "This happened on September 18th, 1924. Back then, folks simply called them the Marble Caves. The roads were little more than wagon tracks. Electricity hadn't reached those passages, and if someone got hurt underground, there wasn't a rescue team waiting with trucks and radios. You gathered whoever knew the country. You carried hemp rope, carbide lamps, canvas stretchers, and whatever nerve you could find before stepping underground. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't." Briggs looked into the fire for several seconds before continuing. "The man at the center of this story was Ranger Samuel Harlan. Most folks around Cave Junction knew him. He'd spent nearly 15 years patrolling these mountains, tracked poachers, recovered lost prospectors, helped haul injured loggers out of ravines. He wasn't the strongest ranger, wasn't the fastest either. But if Sam told you a trail crossed the ridge, you could walk it blindfolded and still find your way." Briggs smiled faintly. "Rock remembers better than people do. Sam used to say that all the time. Funny thing is, he stopped saying it after this rescue." The morning of September 18th, 1924, began cool and damp. A light fog hung between the Douglas firs covering the Siskiyou Mountains, and the smell of wet cedar drifted through the valley after rain during the night. Samuel Harlan was repairing a split section of fencing outside the small ranger station when he heard hoofbeats climbing the narrow trail. He stood, wiped his hands on his canvas trousers, and watched a young telegraph courier pull his horse to a stop. The boy looked exhausted. "Mr. Harlan?" Sam nodded. "What happened?" The courier caught his breath. "There's been an accident near the Marble Caves." Sam set the hammer down. "Anybody dead?" "Don't know. Group of young fellows from Grant's Pass. One of them fell. Deep. They can't reach him." Sam looked toward the mountains. "How long ago?" "About 2 hours. Maybe more." The ranger walked inside without another word. He grabbed his broad-brimmed felt hat, heavy wool coat, climbing gloves, carbide lamp, and the coil of hemp rope hanging beside the door. Outside, the courier watched quietly. "You climbing down?" Sam secured the rope across his shoulder. "If he's still breathing. Somebody has to." By noon, nearly a dozen men had gathered near the cave entrance. 2 deputy sheriffs, 3 local miners, a physician from Cave Junction, several volunteers. Everyone stood around the narrow opening leading into the restricted passages. No one seemed eager to go first. A young miner removed his hat. We've shouted. No answer for nearly half an hour. The physician folded his arms. If he survived the fall, he won't survive the night down there. One of the deputies looked into the darkness. A man went down that shaft back in 1918. They never brought him back, nobody replied. Old stories have a way of making sensible men quiet. Sam stepped to the edge and studied the entrance. Fresh boot prints, loose limestone, broken brush. One set of drag marks where someone had crawled to the rim after trying to help. Everything matched the account. He knelt and picked up a small fragment of broken carbide lamp glass, fresh, still sharp. The injured man hadn't gone exploring alone. His companions had tried to reach him. That was his first mistake. People panic. Then they climb where they shouldn't. Fortunately, they'd stopped before making the accident worse. Sam stood. Who's got the longest rope? A miner lifted a coil of thick hemp line. 80 feet. It'll have to do. The ranger inspected every foot of it himself, worn in places, still strong. Good enough. He looked around at the men gathered beside the shaft. I'll go down. No one argued, not because they weren't afraid, because every man there already knew Sam Harlan was the only one likely to come back up. The volunteers began building anchors around 3 old cedar trees growing near the cave entrance. Each knot was checked twice, each wrap pulled tight. Briggs looked around the cabin at us young hunters. Then he said quietly, "Courage isn't climbing into a hole because you're fearless. It's climbing because somebody at the bottom doesn't have another chance." The old cabin fell silent. Outside, the wind pushed through the pines. Inside, every one of us leaned a little closer to the fire as Mr. Briggs took another slow sip of black coffee. Then he told us what happened after Samuel Harlan disappeared into the darkness beneath the marble caves. The fire settled into a steady glow as old Mr. Briggs lifted his coffee mug with both hands. He stared into the flames for a long moment before continuing. "You boys have probably noticed something already," he said. "Forests usually give you room to think. Caves don't. Once you start down, there's no sky to judge the weather, no trees to mark direction, and no quick way back if something goes wrong." He looked around the cabin. That's why experienced woodsmen respected caves. Not because they believed in ghost stories. Because underground, the mountain makes every decision. The volunteers worked quietly around the cave entrance. 3 thick hemp ropes had been wrapped around a cluster of old cedar trees growing only a few yards from the shaft. Each knot was pulled tight by hand before another man checked it again. Samuel Harlan watched without saying much. A rescue begins long before the first man leaves the ground. One careless knot could kill 2 people instead of 1. He wasn't about to let that happen. He tested every wrap himself. Then he fastened a broad leather climbing belt around his waist. There were no mechanical descenders in those days, no locking carabiners. Just a leather belt, a heavy hemp rope, thick gloves, and men at the surface controlling every foot of line by hand. The physician walked over carrying a small canvas bag. "If he's alive," he said, "keep him warm." Samuel nodded. Inside were bandages, a flask of boiled water, a wooden splint, morphine, and a wool blanket folded tightly enough to fit inside the satchel. That was the entire medical kit. Briggs looked at us. "Nowadays, you boys expect helicopters. Back then, if you survived long enough for somebody to reach you, that was considered good luck." Samuel lit his carbide lamp. A sharp hiss escaped the burner before the flame steadied behind the reflector. The yellow light pushed only a short distance into the darkness, enough to see the limestone wall, not much more. He tugged once on the rope. The men above answered with 2 firm pulls, their signal, ready. Samuel stepped backward over the edge. The shaft swallowed him almost immediately. Sunlight disappeared after only 20 feet. Above him, the opening became a pale circle framed by cedar branches. Voices changed underground, not quieter, different. Sometimes they echoed. Sometimes they vanished completely. Samuel had learned years earlier never to follow a sound inside a cave. Sound bounced wherever the stone wanted it to go. His boots searched carefully for every foothold. Wet limestone offered little forgiveness. One careless step, one patch of smooth rock, and gravity finished the job. Water dripped steadily from cracks high above his head. The air smelled of damp stone and old earth, cold enough that his breath lingered briefly in the light of his lamp. 30 feet down, he stopped. According to local miners, a narrow limestone shelf crossed the shaft there. His left boot searched for it. Nothing. He lowered himself another foot. Still nothing. Another 2 feet. Only empty air. Samuel frowned. He raised the lamp. The walls looked right. Same white marble, same mineral streaks, same narrow cracks. He glanced upward. The rope had descended farther than he expected. Perhaps the miners remembered the depth incorrectly. It happened. Memory measures distance poorly underground. He continued descending. 4 feet later, his boots finally found solid rock. The shelf existed, just lower than everyone had described. He made a mental note and kept moving. The ledge barely held his boots. He crouched beside the wall and studied the stone. Fresh scrape marks, broken limestone, drops of dried blood. The injured fellow had struck the shelf on the way down. Painful. Probably enough to slow the fall before reaching the bottom. Samuel nodded to himself. That likely explained why the young man was still alive. Evidence first, conclusions later. That was how experienced rangers stayed alive. Something near the wall caught his eye. A felt hat, crushed beneath loose rock, one side stained dark. He picked it up. The leather sweatband inside carried initials burned into it. RF. One of the young men waiting above confirmed the injured fellow's name was Ryan Foster. Samuel placed the hat inside his canvas bag. No sense leaving it behind. Families usually wanted every belonging returned. The shaft narrowed below the ledge. Samuel had to turn sideways to continue. The hemp rope rubbed against damp limestone, producing a slow, grinding sound. Tiny flakes of white marble drifted into the darkness beneath him. He paused every few minutes to inspect the rope. Natural fibers wear quickly against sharp rock. A frayed rope has no interest in second chances. He gave the agreed signal. 2 sharp tugs. The men above answered immediately. Good. The line remained secure. Communication underground didn't require words, only trust. Another 15 feet. The shaft opened into a wider chamber. Samuel lowered the carbide lamp. The yellow light spread across broken stone. A boot, then another. Finally, a man sitting against the wall, his right leg bent beneath him at an angle no healthy leg should ever take. The young fellow slowly raised his head. You came. Samuel stepped off the rope onto solid ground. Told you somebody would. The young man laughed weakly. I wasn't sure anymore. Samuel knelt beside him. I'm Samuel Harlan. What's your name, son? Ryan. Ryan Foster. Can you move your arms? Ryan lifted both hands. Good. Any pain in your neck? Ryan shook his head carefully. No. Back? No. Samuel nodded. Good signs. He'd seen enough broken bones to recognize luck when he found it. The leg looked bad. The rest of the boy looked better than expected. Samuel removed the wool blanket from his satchel and wrapped it around Ryan's shoulders. "Small question." Ryan nodded. "How long have you been awake?" Ryan looked toward the darkness. "I don't know. I passed out after I hit. When I woke up, I started shouting." Samuel continued checking the injured leg while listening. "My friends answered for a while. Then everything got quiet." Samuel reached for the wooden splint. "That's normal." "They had to climb out." Ryan hesitated. "I know." He swallowed. "But..." Samuel looked up. "But what?" Ryan stared toward a narrow passage, disappearing beyond the edge of the carbide lamp. "I kept hearing somebody walking." Samuel followed his gaze. The chamber remained empty. Only wet limestone, scattered rocks, and darkness where the light ended. He listened for several seconds. Nothing. Water dripped steadily somewhere deeper inside the mountain. That was all. He looked back at Ryan. "You hit your head. That can play tricks on a man." Ryan nodded slowly. "Maybe." Samuel believed that himself. Head injuries confuse memory. Exhaustion changes how people hear. There was no reason to think otherwise, not yet. He reached for the hemp haul line coiled beside his feet. "Let's get you back to daylight." As he bent to tie the rescue sling around Ryan's chest, a single pebble rolled quietly out of the dark passage behind them. Samuel stopped. He lifted the carbide lamp. Its yellow light reached only a few yards before darkness swallowed everything beyond. He waited. Nothing moved. No second sound followed. After nearly half a minute, he lowered the lamp again. Loose rock, water, time. Caves were full of simple explanations. He tied the final knot. At least. That's what he believed when he gave the signal to begin the climb. The cabin remained quiet. Old Mr. Briggs reached into the fire with an iron poker and shifted one of the burning logs. A shower of sparks climbed toward the chimney before disappearing. He didn't look at any of us. He kept watching the flames. "Boys, finding the injured man is only half the rescue. Getting him back out. That's where most people lose their lives." He rubbed his gray beard thoughtfully. "Gravity doesn't stop working just because you've done the hard part. Neither does the mountain." Samuel Harlan pulled the wool blanket tighter around Ryan's shoulders before kneeling beside the broken leg once more. "You ever break a bone before?" Ryan shook his head. "No, sir." "Good." Samuel gave a faint smile. "Then don't start moving around now." The young man managed the slightest grin despite the pain. "I'll do my best." Samuel removed 2 smooth ash splints from the canvas medical satchel and laid them beside Ryan's leg. There weren't many choices in 1924. You stabilized what you could. Then you trusted the men holding the rope. He gently felt along the injured leg. The thigh bone had broken clean, painful, but the skin hadn't opened. That mattered. Broken bone inside the skin gave a man far better odds than broken bone outside it. He wrapped folded wool around the leg before securing the splints with broad canvas strips. Ryan clenched his jaw so hard the muscles stood out beneath his cheeks. Samuel noticed. "You're doing fine," Ryan nodded. "Trying to." The ranger reached for the hemp rescue sling and worked it carefully beneath Ryan's arms. Every knot had a purpose. Every wrap kept the injured man from slipping once they left the chamber floor. He checked each one twice, then once more. Old Mr. Briggs looked around the cabin. "I've buried men who trusted a knot they never bothered checking. You don't make that mistake twice. Samuel gave 2 sharp tugs on the rope. A few moments later, 2 answering pulls came from above. The men at the surface were ready. Good. Communication didn't require voices, just patience. Ryan. Yes, sir? When they start pulling, keep your arms crossed. Don't grab the walls. I won't. If the ropes swing, let it. Ryan swallowed. Understood. Samuel nodded. Good man. The first pull lifted Ryan only a few inches from the cave floor. Samuel watched carefully. No twisting, no slipping, no loose knots. Everything held exactly as planned. He placed one hand against Ryan's shoulder to steady him. Easy now. The young man disappeared upward slowly, boots brushing against damp limestone. Samuel climbed beneath him, guiding the sling whenever it drifted too close to the rock. The hemp rope groaned softly under their combined weight. Natural fibers always spoke under heavy load. Experienced climbers listened. If a rope suddenly became silent, that was when you worried. 20 feet above the chamber floor, Samuel reached the narrow ledge where he'd found the dried blood. Ryan stopped there while the men above adjusted the hauling angle. Samuel climbed beside him. You all right? Ryan breathed carefully. So far. Samuel took another look at the splints. Still secure. Good. He brushed loose limestone away from the edge before signaling the haul crew again. As they prepared to continue, Ryan quietly spoke. Mr. Harlan? When you climbed down, Samuel looked at him. Did you see my friends? They're all waiting above. Ryan frowned. I didn't mean up there. Samuel waited. I thought... Ryan hesitated. Never mind. What? I thought somebody came looking before you. Samuel shook his head. No one else came down. Ryan looked confused. I could have sworn. His voice faded. Samuel rested one hand on the young man's shoulder. You struck your head pretty hard. It does strange things. Ryan nodded slowly. I suppose. Samuel believed it himself. Concussions mixed memories together. That explanation fit everything he knew. There was no reason to invent another. The climb resumed. The shaft narrowed until Samuel's shoulders brushed against the cold marble walls. His carbide lamp hissed steadily beside him. Then, without warning, the flame shrank. Not completely, just enough for the yellow light to dim. Samuel immediately stopped climbing. He closed the air valve, checked the water chamber. Everything appeared normal. A few careful adjustments. The flame brightened again. Old carbide lamps could be temperamental. Moisture sometimes interfered with the gas. Nothing unusual. He clipped the lamp back onto his belt. The rope above tightened once more. Ryan continued upward. Samuel followed. The climb grew slower. Not because the rope team lacked strength, because every man above understood what happened when people hurried underground. About halfway to the surface, Samuel noticed fresh scrape marks across the limestone, long, narrow, almost parallel. He stopped long enough to examine them. They looked recent. White marble dust still clung to the edges. Perhaps another rescue rope had rubbed there years ago. Perhaps falling rock had done it. Either explanation seemed reasonable. He continued climbing. A cool draft drifted down the shaft. Odd. Most caves breathe slowly. This current felt stronger than Samuel remembered. He raised the carbide lamp. The flame bent gently toward the chamber below, air moving upward. He frowned. Weather outside often changed cave airflow. Storms could reverse natural drafts. Nothing more than that. Still, he made a mental note. The opening above finally appeared. Sunlight filtered through cedar branches surrounding the shaft. After nearly an hour underground, even weak daylight felt almost blinding. Several volunteers leaned over the edge. Easy, easy. Hands reached down. Ryan disappeared over the rim first. The physician immediately knelt beside him. Samuel climbed the final few feet before strong hands pulled him safely onto solid ground. He removed the leather climbing belt and rolled his shoulders. Only then did he realize how tired he felt. Underground, your body spends energy you don't notice until daylight returns. The volunteers carried Ryan toward a waiting wagon where blankets had already been laid across the bed. The physician climbed aboard beside him. "You'll keep the leg." Ryan smiled weakly. "I'd rather." The old doctor laughed. "Good answer." While the others gathered ropes and equipment, Samuel walked back toward the cave entrance, not because he'd forgotten anything. Habit. Experienced rangers always took one last look. He stood quietly at the edge of the shaft. The cave had gone still again. Water dripped somewhere far below. Nothing else. He picked up the crushed felt hat Ryan had dropped during the fall and brushed the limestone dust from it. Then something caught his eye, near the edge of the shaft. A fresh boot print. Samuel crouched. It wasn't Ryan's. Ryan had worn smooth-soled town shoes. This print carried a deep leather heel with square hobnails. Samuel looked around. Every volunteer nearby wore similar boots. Nothing unusual there, except the print faced toward the shaft, only toward it. He searched the damp ground. No matching track led away, no second footprint. Just one clean impression ending at the edge. He studied it another few seconds. Loose soil sometimes held prints unevenly. Wind erased details. People stepped over one another's tracks. Plenty of ordinary explanations. He stood. The rescue had been a long one. Fatigue makes a man notice odd things. He brushed the thought aside. As he started toward the waiting wagon, one of the miners called after him. "Everything all right, Sam?" Samuel glanced back at the cave entrance one last time, then nodded. "Just making sure we didn't leave anything behind." The miner smiled. "You never do." Samuel returned the smile. "No, I try not to." Old Mr. Briggs looked into the fire and slowly shook his head. That was the last ordinary thought Samuel Harlan had about those caves. Everything that happened after that is why I'm still telling this story all these years later. The cabin fell silent. Outside, the wind swept through the pines, carrying sleet against the windows. Nobody around the fire reached for another cup of coffee. Every one of us wanted to know what Samuel discovered after the rescue was supposed to be over. The fire crackled softly as old Mr. Briggs leaned back in his chair. For a while, he simply watched the flames. Outside, the wind rolled through the pine trees surrounding the cabin, carrying sleet across the roof before fading into the darkness. Finally, he spoke. "Boys, every rescue ends twice. The first ends when everybody gets home. The second ends when every question has an answer." He slowly shook his head. This one never reached the second ending. Ryan Foster survived. The physician in Cave Junction reset the broken leg that same evening. It wasn't pleasant. There weren't many options in those days. The operation was done with little more than ether, steady hands, and two strong men holding Ryan still. Samuel stopped by the doctor's office the following afternoon. Ryan looked pale, but his color had improved. His right leg rested inside a heavy wooden splint suspended above the bed. The young man smiled when Samuel entered. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Samuel pulled up a chair. "Figured I'd make sure you hadn't scared the doctor away." Ryan laughed softly. "Not yet." The doctor stepped out, giving them a few quiet minutes alone. Samuel poured water from a stone pitcher into a glass and handed it over. "You remember much," Ryan thought for a moment. "The climb into the cave. The fall. Waking up." He frowned slightly. "After that?" "Not much," Samuel nodded. "That's common after a hard knock to the head." Ryan looked down at the blanket covering his legs. "I remember shouting." Samuel waited. "And?" "I remember hearing people answer." "You did?" Ryan looked back at him. "No, not my friends." Samuel remained silent. Ryan continued carefully. The voices sounded closer. "I thought somebody was already down there." Samuel folded his hands together. "There wasn't." Ryan gave a slow nod. "I know. I've been telling myself that." Neither man spoke again for nearly a minute. Finally, Samuel stood. "Get some rest." Ryan smiled. "You ever going back down there?" Samuel looked toward the window before answering. "If somebody needs help, I will." It was the only answer a ranger could honestly give. 3 days later, Samuel filed his report. It wasn't a long document. The facts were simple. 1 injured civilian, successful rope rescue, broken femur, minor head injury, no fatalities, no equipment failures, no recommendations beyond replacing several worn sections of rope before the next emergency. Old Mr. Briggs smiled faintly. Paper has a funny way of making dangerous days sound ordinary. That's why I always trusted the man writing the report more than the report itself. Life around the marble caves returned to normal. Autumn settled over the Siskiyou Mountains. The first yellow leaves began collecting along the wagon road leading toward the ranger station. Visitors still came to see the cave entrance. Local guides still led tours through the safer passages. Hunters passed through on their way into the higher ridges. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened. Samuel almost stopped thinking about the rescue altogether. Almost. Late one afternoon, one of the miners who had helped work the ropes stopped by the ranger station. His name was Walter Keene, a dependable man, not easily rattled. He removed his hat before stepping inside. "Got a minute, Sam?" Samuel looked up from sharpening an axe. "Sure." Walter shifted uneasily. "I've been thinking about that rescue." Samuel set the whetstone down. "So have I." Walter hesitated. "You remember when Ryan came over the rim?" Samuel nodded. "Of course. I was standing at the west anchor. I know where you were." Walter rubbed the back of his neck. "I could have sworn." He stopped. Samuel waited. Walter sighed. "Never mind. Go on." "I thought I saw another lamp lower in the shaft." The room remained quiet. Samuel answered almost immediately. "Probably mine." Walter shook his head. "No. Yours was moving. This one wasn't." Samuel considered that. "You sure?" Walter frowned. "No. That's the trouble. I've replayed it 100 times. Could have been sunlight catching the wall. Could have been my eyes." Samuel nodded. "That's likely." Walter seemed relieved to hear someone else say it. "Yeah, probably." He put his hat back on and headed for the door. Just before leaving, he looked back. "You ever notice people remember things differently after a bad day?" Samuel smiled. "They always do." Walter left. Samuel returned to sharpening the axe. Still. He found himself pausing longer than usual between strokes. The following week brought heavy rain. Water poured down the limestone cliffs surrounding the cave entrance. Samuel rode out to inspect the trails before reopening them to visitors. Rockfalls often followed storms. Better to find loose ground before somebody else did. He tied his horse near the old cedar grove and walked the final stretch alone. The cave entrance looked exactly as he remembered. Fresh water trickled over the limestone. The rescue anchors had already been removed. Only faint grooves in the bark of the cedar trees showed where the ropes had once been tied. Samuel crouched near the edge of the shaft. Rain had softened the soil. Boot prints from several recent visitors crossed the clearing. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed something. Near the largest cedar, the end of a hemp rope protruded from beneath a layer of wet leaves. He pulled gently. Only 3 feet remained. The rest had been cleanly severed, not frayed, not snapped. Cut. Samuel examined the fibers. The cut wasn't fresh. The rope had weathered for weeks. He turned it over in his hands. Every rescue rope had been counted before leaving the site. He remembered helping coil them himself. Nothing had been left behind. He looked around the clearing. No other equipment remained. Just that short piece of rope. He slipped it into his coat pocket. Perhaps one of the volunteers had overlooked it. Simple enough. Still, Samuel couldn't remember anyone reporting a missing line. That evening he stopped by Walter's cabin. Without saying much, he laid the rope on the table. Walter studied it. "I don't remember cutting this." "Neither do I," Samuel answered. Walter picked it up. "This isn't from the haul line." "No. The fibers are finer." Samuel nodded. "I noticed." They both knew every rope used during the rescue. This one didn't match any of them. Walter looked toward the window where rain tapped steadily against the glass. Maybe somebody else was down there before we arrived. Samuel considered the possibility. Prospectors, trespassers, curious boys. It happened often enough. But if someone had been there, why had no one mentioned it? He folded the rope and slipped it back into his pocket. No sense guessing. Walter agreed. Facts first, questions later. That had always been Samuel's way. Old Mr. Briggs rested both hands on his walking stick. He looked at every one of us sitting around the fire. Remember that. Good woodsmen don't chase answers they can't prove. They gather evidence. Then they let the evidence speak. He smiled faintly. The trouble for Samuel was that the evidence had just started arguing with itself. Outside, the wind struck the cabin once more. The fire settled with a quiet pop. Not one of us spoke, because we all knew the rescue was over. And somehow, the real story had only just begun. The fire had burned lower by the time old Mr. Briggs spoke again. Nobody around the cabin moved. Outside, the wind drifted through the pines with a low, steady sound, and sleet tapped against the windows before sliding away into the darkness. Briggs folded his hands over the top of his walking stick. Most folks think a rescue ends when the injured man gets home. They're wrong. For the rescuer, it ends when he finally stops replaying every decision he made underground. He looked into the fire. Samuel Harlan never quite reached that point. The weeks passed. Autumn settled deeper into the Siskiyou Mountains. The maple leaves around the ranger station turned gold before the first cold rain stripped most of them from the branches. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm. Hunters stopped by asking about game trails. Loggers reported fallen timber-blocking wagon roads. Prospectors wandered in, looking for forgotten claims. Samuel handled every call the same way he always had. Calm, methodical, professional. Anyone watching him would have said the rescue had already become another completed entry in the incident ledger. Only Samuel knew otherwise. Late one afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Ryan Foster's rescue, Samuel sat alone inside the ranger station updating trail maps. The stove crackled softly behind him. An oil lantern hung above the desk, throwing long shadows across the handwritten survey charts. Without thinking, he sharpened the same carpenter's pencil 3 different times. Only when the point snapped did he realize he hadn't written another word for nearly 10 minutes. He set the knife down. The rescue was still occupying his thoughts. That bothered him. Experienced rangers learned to leave yesterday's decisions behind. Otherwise, the next emergency suffered. A knock sounded at the station door. Samuel looked up. Walter Keene stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat. "Evening," Samuel nodded. "Come in." Walter removed his hat. "I was passing by. Thought I'd see how you're doing." Samuel smiled faintly. "I've been better." Walter laughed. "Haven't we all?" For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. Storm damage, washed out trails, a black bear seen near the river crossing. Finally, Walter looked toward the stove. "You still thinking about that rescue?" Samuel answered honestly. "Some." Walter stared at the floor. "So am I." Neither man said anything else. They didn't have to. Men who've worked dangerous country know when silence says enough. A few days later, Ryan Foster arrived at the ranger station on crutches. His leg was healing well, slowly. He leaned the crutches against the porch railing before stepping inside. Samuel looked up from repairing a leather saddle strap. "Walking already?" Ryan grinned. "The doctor says I don't listen very well." Samuel chuckled. "I figured that out weeks ago." Ryan handed him a small paper sack. "My mother insisted I bring this." Samuel looked inside. Fresh biscuits, still warm. "Tell her I appreciate it." Ryan nodded. "I will." They sat on the porch overlooking the valley while afternoon sunlight filtered through the fir trees. Neither mentioned the rescue. Not at first. Sometimes men avoid difficult conversations until they become unavoidable. Finally, Ryan spoke. "I've remembered one more thing." Samuel looked at him quietly. Ryan shrugged. "Probably doesn't matter." "What is it?" Ryan rubbed his hands together. "When I woke up down there, I wasn't shouting." Samuel frowned slightly. "You told me you were." Ryan nodded. "I know. I've thought about it ever since. I remember trying, but I couldn't catch my breath." Samuel listened without interrupting. Ryan continued. "I don't remember calling for help. I remember hearing help." Samuel waited. "I always assumed my friends were talking." He smiled uneasily. "Funny what the mind does after a hard knock." Samuel nodded. "It certainly can." Ryan seemed satisfied with that answer. They spent another hour talking about hunting, horses, and the coming winter before Ryan headed home. Samuel watched him disappear down the wagon road, for reasons he couldn't explain. That conversation stayed with him longer than any part of the rescue itself. The following Sunday, Samuel attended church in Cave Junction. After the service ended, Ryan's father quietly caught up with him outside. The older man removed his hat. "I've been meaning to thank you properly." "No need." "There is." He extended his hand. Samuel accepted it. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Ryan's father said quietly, "My boy keeps asking one question." Samuel looked at him. "He wants to know who kept talking to him while he was waiting." Samuel's expression didn't change. "What do you tell him?" The old man sighed. "I tell him he probably heard water." Samuel nodded once. "That's what I'd tell him too." The conversation ended there. Neither man seemed interested in saying anything else. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Cold mornings left frost across the cedar branches surrounding the marble caves. Samuel rode patrol through the area twice each week. He inspected bridges, marked unstable slopes, checked boundary markers before the first heavy snow. Whenever his route passed near the cave entrance, he always slowed his horse, never stopped. Just slowed. He couldn't have explained why. One gray afternoon, he met an elderly prospector walking down the trail. The old fellow carried little more than a shovel and a bedroll. Samuel recognized him immediately. Silas Morgan, one of the oldest prospectors still wandering those mountains. They exchanged greetings. Silas looked toward the distant limestone ridge. "Heard you pulled a young fella out of the marble." Samuel nodded. "Lucky rescue." Silas scratched his beard. "Maybe." Samuel smiled. "You don't sound convinced." Silas shrugged. "I've been around those caves longer than most." Samuel waited. The old prospector looked toward the trees before continuing. "Stone plays tricks." Samuel nodded. "Echoes. Cold air. Darkness." Silas smiled. "Those too." He adjusted the bedroll over his shoulder. "Just don't spend too much time trying to make every strange thing fit together." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Silas gave a tired smile. "Because mountains don't owe us explanations." With that, he tipped his hat and continued down the trail. Samuel watched him disappear among the fir trees. Simple words. Nothing mysterious. Still. He found himself thinking about them for the rest of the ride home. Old Mr. Briggs leaned closer to the fire. The cabin had grown completely silent. That's the mistake young hunters make. They think experience gives a man every answer. He slowly shook his head. Experience teaches you something much more valuable. It teaches you to recognize the difference between facts and assumptions. He looked around at every one of us. Samuel never claimed something impossible happened inside those caves. Neither did Ryan. Neither did Walter. Every one of them described exactly what they believed they experienced. The trouble was, those experiences refused to fit together. Briggs picked up his coffee cup and stared into the dark liquid for a long moment. That bothered Samuel more than any cave ever could. The fire settled with a quiet pop. Outside, the wind eased for the first time that night. Briggs looked toward the frost-covered window before speaking almost to himself. "You boys remember this. A good ranger doesn't force the evidence to match his conclusions. He changes his conclusions until they match the evidence." He looked back at us. Samuel spent the next 20 years trying to do exactly that, and he never completely succeeded. The old cabin grew silent once again. Somewhere beyond the windows, hidden among the dark pines, an owl called only once before the woods became still. None of us around that fire realized it then. But Mr. Briggs had just told us the most unsettling part of the story. Not what Samuel found, what he never could.